Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, FREOPP, for having all of us. I'm Michael Cannon. I'm the Director of Health Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And I'm not going to do long-winded introductions of each of our distinguished panelists. We've got Gregg, we've got Anna, we've got Peter, and we're going to be talking about drug pricing and innovation. And so if you want to bring medical care within the reach of more people, to do that, you first need to have something called medicine. Now, unfortunately, there's a trade-off between those two goals. If medical prices are high, then lots of people are going to create lots of medicines for people to buy because the rewards will be huge. But that means that fewer people are going to be able to afford medicines. If prices for medicines are low, the good news there is that lots of people are going to be able to afford them, but you're not going to have as many medicines available because not as many people are going to invest in developing them. Now, economic theory tells us theoretically what the optimal since there are trade-offs here, economic theory tells us theoretically what the optimal quantities of medicines are going to be and what the optimal, therefore the optimal prices for medicines. It also tells us why markets sadly won't automatically push everyone in the direction of those optimal prices and quantities. And it tells us that while government can intervene and various government interventions could hit or push markets in the direction of those targets, economic theory also tells us that those interventions could be off the mark in either direction as well as hitting the mark. So there are lots of ways that government has intervened in markets that supporters say are pushing markets in the direction of optimality and getting us pushing in the direction of optimality that strikes the proper balance between more medicines and more affordability. But each of those interventions also has its critics who say that this or that intervention is pushing markets in the wrong direction. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. And that brings us to what is the hot topic right now in drug pricing, which is the Medicare program and the new provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And they give the Medicare program the ability to negotiate with drug companies in order to get lower prices out of drug companies than Medicare is paying right now. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question of Anna. I'm going to ask Anna, if you could please. There's a lot of controversy about the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I should mention that you had something to do with getting that law passed. As a former staffer to the Senate Finance Committee, you helped to write that law. But before we get to the Inflation Reduction Act, could you describe how government comes up with the prices that it pays for drugs through the Medicare program right now? Because there's controversy about, obviously there's controversy about how Medicare comes up with those prices and about whether the systems that are currently in place that the Inflation Reduction Act is changing are pushing in the direction of optimality or not. So please, if you could first just describe those prices, or those processes.
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
Probably not the folks watching in internet.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the provision, and maybe before we dive into it, I just want to sort of really quickly talk about what exactly the provision is, which is Medicare negotiation that we're talking about here today, which is that roughly speaking, after a drug has been on the market for a certain number of years, it varies depending on the size of the molecule and so forth, it basically, if there's enough spending on that product, gets selected for negotiation, and the manufacturer can either choose to respond by accepting or going back and forth on a price negotiation with the secretary, with CMS, or they can take their product and all of their products out of Medicare and Medicaid, and cease participating in federal programs, which is something we can talk about in a bit. But this comes as a response to sort of a long-held tradition in Medicare, which is that the government does not negotiate prices and it does not set prices for drugs. Instead, the government in Medicare Part B and Part D, specifically, B is the medical benefit. So these are like outpatient infused drugs, and D is the prescription drugs that you get at a pharmacy, basically has committed government to coverage of drugs based on their list prices. Now, in Part D, there is some negotiation that goes on with the private health plans that actually provide Part D coverage. But that is on the net price level. So list prices are not brought down for those products. And so in general, premiums and copay and coinsurance, all of these things that are generally part of the way that insurance works has been heavily influenced by these rates, which are not set by government currently and are not influenced by government.
So the way the government pays for drugs right now in Medicare Part A, well, it does in Part A as well, but people typically focus on B and D. There are different processes whereby the government comes up with a price, whatever that price is going to be. It's not the negotiation process that occurs in the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you say a little more about, just so the folks at home understand where we're starting, and then I'm going to ask Peter and Gregg to jump in. What exactly are the ways that the government, what are the rules the government comes up with that produce or influence the prices that the government ends up paying in Parts A, drugs in hospitals, Part B, drugs in physicians' offices, and Part D, drugs in retail pharmacies?
Do you want me to just talk through the reimbursement mechanics a little bit? Is that what you're...
At a very broad level.
Okay. Yeah. So in Part A, and this, of course, your mileage may vary depending on the drug. Generally, we talk about bundled payments, and bundled payments is an episode of care in which a patient might come into the hospital and receive treatment for something, and on average, CMS knows that this is how much it takes to care for such a patient. They might make some adjustments based on their severity or where the hospital is located, but the premise here is that there is a fixed payment associated with that episode of care, and whatever it costs to treat that patient is on the hospital. And so the incentive there is for them to control the cost of drugs or to not use super expensive drugs during their hospital stay because it counts against that episode of care. So that's the sort of diagnosis-related group episode of care model. In Part B, a gentleman referred earlier to the average sales price. This is a price that Medicare uses to, it sort of comprises the list price minus discounts and rebates that are given to providers who use the drug. And so this is calculated on a 6-month lag. The ASP is reimbursed with a 6% markup. So in that case, what happens is the provider basically gets the drug and passes through the cost and gets an added 6% on top of that in terms of payment, with some mechanics around how much they paid for it and how much they're getting reimbursed for it based on that 6-month lag. And then in Part D is really prescription drugs that you get at the pharmacy, and that is usually administered, well, it is administered through PBMs, through Part D plans. PBMs are pharmacy benefit managers, and they basically operate formularies which dictate the preference that a drug gets for the in the patients that are covered with that particular prescription drug plan. And in exchange for preferred placement on that formulary, manufacturers can give PBMs rebates. And so what you see there in those kinds of drugs is generally high list prices but lower net prices because they're offering up rebates to Part D plans, to the PBMs that are administering them. There are some other drugs that, for example, like cancer drugs that are actually protected that have to be covered. In which case there are few rebates but high list prices. So you see sort of these two different dynamics going on in the Part D side. But in general, in Part A, you have this downward pressure on the use of very expensive drugs, which has its pluses and minuses. In B and in D, you have a tendency towards higher costs because of a mix of provider and sort of plan incentives and manufacturer monopolies.
Okay, and now I'm just going to send the microphone down the line here. Given that sort of constellation of policy measures that Congress has put in effect, what is the net effect of all of these different pricing schemes or policies in the Medicare program? Are they pushing in the direction of that optimal trade-off between innovation and low prices, or are they falling short of that mark of optimality, or are they exceeding it, or what? What's your take on this, Peter?
Exclusively in the Medicare population, I think that the program has always been quite generous, and the reason, although cost growth has now mitigated somewhat in the last couple of years, what happens is it just is a steady transfer. So the insurance is good, Coinsurance or out-of-pocket coverage for Part B, the physician drugs, is also pretty generous and widespread. In Part D, although there's now been restructuring with the IRA, it's been pretty catastrophic what has happened because the high prices, and these are the list prices, as Anna mentioned, translate into out-of-pocket costs for consumers that many patients literally can't afford or can only partially afford, so they skip doses. And I just want to back up, and Michael used a lot of very big words, but despite that, he was making a very clear point that many of these discussions, whether it's about the IRA or anything else, fail to consider, which is there are two sides of this coin. And the one side you keep hearing about, including the panel that just preceded us, is innovation, 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 right? Innovation, all it means is new, by the way, another big word. But the exclusive measure of the market's success for pharmaceuticals is this innovation if you have an interest in having high prices. A welfare perspective of it has both pieces, Michael's two sides of his coin. You get the invention of new things, which can improve health, and you have the distribution and access or availability of those new things, which improves health collectively. That is the trade-off. It's a trade-off in most policy challenges. Who pays for it is, I'm sure, something we're going to argue about as well. But it is pointless to focus simply on either new drugs or access without having this balanced view, in my view.
Are we getting too much innovation or too little innovation? Are prices too high or too low generally as a result of just Medicare and its pricing schemes?
Oh, I think the amount of incremental health gains from innovation, just based on how much better the next new drug is so minimal that there's no way the math is right here, right? Because we're losing all the potential health improvements we could get from the distribution of these drugs, right? So we probably treated only a third of people with hepatitis C now, right? Even though we're more than a decade into having drugs for it. So, but that is the other kind of stalking horse or straw man, which is that these new drugs are routinely kind of miraculous, right? And even something like the Alzheimer's space, the disease is a problem. The drugs are not, going to give us much.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of some of those comments, I think if you look at drugs that come out that the FDA has approved, they consider novel drug approvals. These are what many people consider to be sort of the innovative drugs. I don't think we pay enough attention to how a lot of those studies are designed. So I think this happens in a lot of different disease indications, but let's take cancer, for instance. If you dig into a lot of these trials, you'll find that you have the intervention, the drug that you're looking to test. And then if you look at the control arm, the people who aren't getting that treatment, what does that look like? Well, oftentimes it will be placebo, which is kind of what sort of the layperson would expect. But when that person's undergoing cancer treatment, what is the standard of care for that individual? Is it going to be a sugar pill, or is it going to be some kind of existing chemo treatment that's been on the market? And what doses do you give that chemo treatment in? Sometimes the drug companies sort of play these games with the dosage levels to make that the difference between sort of what the baseline is and what the drug is to look bigger than it really is. So I think, to Peter's point when he was talking about that the improvements in these drugs is incremental, may even be worse than that in some cases. I think, to state this another way, this trade-off between innovation and people having financial access to drugs, well, you could put it another way, and you could say, well, if innovation is truly our goal, then why don't we double or triple the price of every drug if we want more innovation? That assertion is obviously doesn't make sense, because in each of us that we understand that there is an implicit trade-off between innovation and people being able to afford or get access to those drugs. And so we need to think more about what that right balance is. And one final point I'll make with this is that to Michael's question, are we out of balance with this, or are we favoring innovation too much? I think that we are, and that may seem obvious based on the prices we pay compared to other countries in the world. But again, so with FREOPP, we do this study every year called the World Index of Healthcare Innovation, where we compare on various measures the health systems of 32 high-income countries across the world. And when you look at 5-year cancer survival rate, for example, the U.S. scores pretty well on it, as you would probably expect. But there's a lot of countries that score better than the United States does, whether it be Switzerland or Israel or Belgium, just to name a few. And they don't have the same access to drugs that we do because they have policies in place that limit the cost more of drugs. And so, and despite that, they're having better results than we are. So I think we need to take a look at those things more closely and realize that we do need to deal with the pricing side, people being able to get access to these drugs while still having an innovative culture. And there are ways to do that that actually involve, in many ways, removing the government from the equation and letting the market get to that price, as Michael was alluding to.
Could I add something here just really quickly?
Please weigh in on whether you think existing policy is falling short of optimality, hitting it perfectly, or we're getting too much innovation.
I think my answer to that would actually be both. I think there's two ways to ruin innovation, right? One is to pay absolutely nothing for it. And then the other way is to pay everything for it, like all of your consumer surplus for it. And I think we are currently in a situation where there's a mix of that happening. So we are paying a lot of money very late in drugs' life for, incremental studies, for example, right? Or drugs that look very similar to each other. The question isn't whether or not that creates additional benefits for the patients. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. There are some patients maybe that benefit from, the fifth statin that came onto the market, right? We're not having that debate necessarily. Also, sort of implicitly we are. I think the question is, where's the right point? And I don't know that we have really had we don't have a very good understanding of what value we're getting out of these products at this point. And I think we don't signal it either. One of the great opportunities that's coming out of this sort of Medicare negotiation is that even though we're negotiating now for drugs that are older, at the very least, CMS can put out an explanation of why they accepted a certain bid or why the price landed where it did. And I would very much hope that in that explanation, they include an assessment of the efficacy of the drug and the benefits that it adds, because that will start to send signals to the market that says, here's the premium we're willing to pay for something that works better than something else, right? And I think that is important to sort of have inherent. We don't currently have that in the system, and I think that is a huge, mechanical issue that you can see it across A, B, D, you can see it across all of the different benefits, because we are not tying the benefit of the drug, evidence of the benefit of the drug, to the price of the drug. And that is the underlying sort of defect in it, in my view.
That raises an interesting question. When, in the past, the federal government has tried to evaluate the efficacy of things that Medicare buys, and the example that always comes to my mind is spinal fusion. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe, is when the studies started coming through showing that actually spinal fusion surgeries left these patients in even worse back pain than they had initially. There were a number of studies, and there are people at, I think, the Office of Technology Assessment, as well as AHCPR, the Alliance for Healthcare Policy and Research, which was an agency that advised the Medicare program on what it should cover and what it shouldn't cover. They looked at these studies. They said Medicare should not cover these surgeries anymore because they're not helping. They're leaving people worse off, and they're costing billions and billions of dollars. When the Republicans took over the House of Representatives in 1995, after 40 years in the wilderness, one of their rallying cries was to push back against this attempt at big government making your medical decisions by defunding AHCPR for having the gall to suggest that Medicare should not spend money on these low-value procedures. And while they didn't completely defund AHCPR, they did clip its wings. They cut its budget. They took away its ability to recommend coverage decisions to the Medicare program, and they renamed it AHRQ, Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research. That's where AHRQ came from. So getting prices down, it sounded like everyone on the panel agrees that probably Medicare is erring on the side of setting prices too high, and we're getting too much of at least certain types of innovation, drugs that are maybe not, maybe providing value, maybe not providing as much value as they would need to justify the prices. And it's very difficult, it's proving very difficult for Congress to try to get those prices down. I mean, Congress has failed. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is evidence that Congress is like, okay, we're no good at this negotiating drug prices ourselves. We're going to give the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services new power so that they can do it. What do we, as difficult as that is, should they be throwing, as Anna suggested, the efficacy of those treatments into the mix, or are we going to see a repeat of what we've seen with other attempts by Medicare to reduce consumption of low-value medical care?
You're asking me, the forecasting is going to be challenging here. I mean, so many things could change in terms of political power. But I do want to come back. There is two things. One is, I think of Medicare primarily as a price taker as opposed to setting prices. It's probably a pretty important distinction. So even though Medicare administers Part D, Medicare essentially takes, although there's a competitive market for premiums, Medicare sort of takes the market averages of those and then gives it back to the Part D plans as support to then provide coverage. Not only that, but it is still a backstop so that if the plan spends more than it projected, Medicare reimburses it. So it's not 100% reimbursement, but still, that sort of risk protection, which was, I believe, designed to be temporary when it was instituted 15, 17 years ago, has persisted. So in large measure, the market just sort of, and the costs flow through. On the doctor office side, the Part B drug, it's pure, right? It's just whatever the manufacturer is charging on average in the marketplace. There's some exceptions there. Then just the doctors just send in bills when they give the drug and they get reimbursed that amount plus a few percentage points, which came up on the prior panel if you were here. So I don't think of it as setting it today. And the other thing, the critical element of the IRA's pricing component, I mean, there's the inflation piece, but is that it isn't actually about drugs when they enter the market. It's an artificial way or a different way of enforcing what is widely accepted, which is that monopolies on drugs are time limited. And because of a lot of problem shenanigans and awkwardness around ending the life of expensive drugs, either through generic introduction or for biologic drugs, the same kind of idea called biosimilars, because that sort of doesn't work that well because there's patent stuff going on and one company paying another company to not compete with it and stuff like that. The IRA, what it's really done is said, okay, fine. These are the times, and if you're a super profitable drug, you know, your time-limited monopoly is going to end because we're going to start negotiating with you. The monopoly actually doesn't end, but the benefits of it, the ability to freely price, do.
The benefits in Medicare specifically,
Yeah,
not any other
agreed.
part of the market.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
No.
Okay.
I'll just add to that as Peter was alluding to, a lot of this has to do with the way we treat small molecule drugs differently than biologics in the law. So this paradigm that we have where, as they also mentioned on the previous panel, the United States does a really good job of substituting generics. We 90% of drugs dispensed in the U.S. are generic drugs. And that's actually a large part of the reason why, especially in recent years, we've seen that CPIRX number be essentially flat, is because most of the drugs that are prescribed are low-cost drugs. But we have this problem specifically in the biologics market. So 46% of all drug spending are biologics, despite being less than 1% of all drugs dispensed. So if we understand that, and we understand, well, why is that the case? Well, for small molecules, the paradigm that we have in this country is governed by Hatch-Waxman, that bill in 1984, which I would argue is actually one of the best healthcare bills that Congress has ever created in terms of trying to encourage competition. But for biologics, that's governed by the Biologics Price and Competition Act, which was inserted or embedded into the Affordable Care Act. And under that paradigm, biologics get 12 years of FDA exclusivity versus 5 years for small molecules. So the government is already giving biologics a whole lot more cover in terms of that monopoly power. And we're seeing drug companies exploit that. And the IRA is one way of saying, no, we're not going to allow you to have this extended period. We're not going to allow you to play games with the patent system through patent thicketing. And I mean, AbbVie was the classic example of this, right? They just finally got biosimilars to that drug, and they were on the market for 20 years, never mind how long the drug existed as it went through clinical trials. It went far beyond what a patent term would give to that company, and yet they were able to exploit the law. I often say that the people who deserve to be the highest priced have the highest salaries in these drug companies is not the researchers in the labs. It's the attorneys that can use the law to their advantage and keep these drugs in a monopoly status. And so the IRA is, albeit I understand the arguments that this is kind of a sledgehammer in a way, at least in Medicare, but it is a way to say to the drug companies that enough is enough.
So we only have a few more minutes. I'm going to give you each 3 questions, and you can pick it and choose which among them you want to answer. To set them up, we're now in the phase where the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have selected the 10 drugs that are going to be subject to the IRA's negotiation process. All 10 manufacturers of all 10 drugs have said that they are going to negotiate. The Congressional Budget Office has guesstimated that this process will reduce prices for those drugs by about 50% on average. So this is real money that we're talking about, considering that one of those drugs has, at least one of them has billions of dollars in revenue from the Medicare program per year. Okay, and some of those manufacturers are, even though they're negotiating with Medicare, they're also suing to block these provisions. Okay, so one of the arguments they're making in those lawsuits is that this is coercive, that the Medicare program, this isn't a negotiation, the Medicare program is coercing them into lowering prices, and some have even alleged that this is basically theft of their drugs by forcing them to sell prices lower than they want to. So my first question is it coercive? Is there coercion happening here in the IRA's drug negotiation provisions? Second, will it work? Do we think that they will actually succeed in getting prices for these drugs down? And third, and this is sort of the fun one, is it ironic that the people who say that the party that says that they're for limited government is actually trying to reduce, is fighting an effort to limit government spending by reducing the prices for these drugs, while the party that everyone says is the party of big government is the one that is actually trying to get government spending on these products down? So why don't we start, Gregg, and then Woodback.
Oh, which to choose? Yeah, I mean, I guess we can kind of take it all on at once. I know this is probably a countervailing opinion from those on the right, but I don't really believe that the law as it is structured is particularly coercive, at least from a constitutional standpoint, because in the end, these drug companies have a choice. They have a choice whether to accept the price that's negotiated or to walk away. There's no law that says that the drug companies have to sell their drugs in Medicare. This is an optional thing, at least from a constitutional standpoint. Now, I think we've seen from other court decisions in the recent past, depending upon which judge this case ends up coming before, I think they could view sort of a certain level of loss of revenue as being de facto coercion. But I think from a pure constitutional standpoint, I don't think it really passes that test. I think in terms of this, the irony of who is sort of supporting this and who is against it. I think we need to keep in mind that when we talk about the fiscal crisis that's coming and that we're in the middle of, that it's largely driven by healthcare spending, that the deficits and debt are largely driven by that. And we talk a lot about the Medicare Trust Fund, which is sort of a misnomer, but let's just go with it. The Medicare Trust Fund is for Part A. It's for the hospital benefit. We talk a lot about how that's going to run out of money, and then we're going to have these provider cuts, and it's going to be a disaster, and it will have major repercussions when that happens. But what we often forget is that the physician-administered benefits in Part B and the drug benefits in Part D, that is a blank check. There is no limit to how much can be spent there. And that is going to also have a huge role in driving up deficits and debt. And we now see with higher interest rates that's having an even larger impact going into the future. So this is a critical thing. We need to find ways to reduce spending in these public health programs. We have to find a way. Now, if I were designing a way to do that with prescription drugs and Medicare, I probably would not have taken this approach. But be that as it may, this is one way to do it. And actually, my hope is that both sides can come to the table and find better ways to reduce drug spending in Medicare. Also to address more the drug spending in Medicare Part B. One of the things that Anna was mentioning here was this idea of protected classes. Why we need to have that, I'm not exactly sure why, because really these drugs, if they are of high value, if Medicare patients want them, they'll be covered. In fact, Medicare really doesn't have many strong mechanisms to fight against coverage of a drug that's FDA approved. So why we need these protected classes, which only serve to drive up prices, I'm not quite sure. But the other part of this too is that with Part B drugs, we don't have sort of a curated formulary process. We don't have a way to say, look, we're going to favor this drug over that drug because it can be provided at a lower cost. So there are ways that we can use free market principles to lower prescription drug costs that would essentially make the IRA obsolete. I mentioned that time frame with biologics having a longer time span of FDA exclusivity. If we were to tighten up the patent process, we wouldn't even need the IRA to help lower drug prices. And so all of this is to say that I hope that Republicans and Democrats can now come together. Now that this law is on the books, it brings Republicans to the table and says, let's come together and let's find ways to use market principles to help further drive down the cost of drugs.
I think I'm going to hold my comment on the protected class. We can talk about that. But just to sort of come back to this notion of is it a free market sort of action? I do think it is, mostly because it's sort of ludicrous to think of the government as just purely government when in fact it's a payer. And a payer inherently has a willingness to pay for things. We should be taking that into account. That's generally what negotiation is. It's also why I don't think that this is a coercive law. It's very simply a law in which manufacturers can either accept that this is a condition of participation or they can choose not to be part of the program. And that those are actually things that providers as well as manufacturers in the past have done. Their conditions of participation are a very standard part of Medicare at this point. If you don't like Medicare's rates, you cannot participate in Medicare. This is standard in most other parts of the benefit. One thing we haven't talked about, and I just kind of want to highlight this, we haven't talked much about what this actually does to innovation, and I just want to point that out, that in fact, for some of these drugs, these are really aging products. They are a significant chunk of their manufacturer's portfolio. And when I was saying earlier that the one way to ruin innovation is to pay a lot for something, this is one of the problems, right? We continue to pay a lot for these things. We continue to remunerate activity that in truth isn't as innovative as it could be. And one of the things that we saw back when the Supreme Court ruled in the FTC versus Actavis decision, which was essentially saying, no, you can't pay a generic entrant to delay their entry into the market. Companies that were doing that were forced to then actually put more money into R&D for new products. And you saw also a reduction in the discontinuation of pipeline assets and so forth amongst those companies that would have otherwise entered into these pay-for-delay contracts. And I think we can expect something similar to happen here. Now, the interesting thing here is, to Michael, your earlier question was whether or not we think that this is going to control spending in the long term. And I would argue that this is actually the way in which we're going to see rising spending again, because this particular policy does not control drug prices. It does not effectuate that willingness to pay early in a drug's life. And so what's going to happen is that manufacturers will start to launch drugs, more new drugs at high prices, at continuously high prices, and that these are going to displace some of the things that are currently being taken off through innovation, right? When manufacturers are facing reduced revenues from older products, they have to buy new products to develop. This is kind of a part of the natural life cycle of a company. And so we should be expecting that. And I think this is also going to be a thing that eventually triggers a larger rollout of these provisions, which now exist, which now have precedent in Medicare, to potentially to younger drugs, to more drugs, and so forth, because now that's sort of the benchmark we have.
Sure. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to the coercion question. The initial estimates, we'll have to see how it all plays out, suggest that this is not only quite viable, I think, in terms of negotiation of prices, but also probably a lot less scary than the sky is falling predictions sounded. I mean, the projected, for some perspective, projected reduction in prices will leave these prices higher than they are in the OECD average countries, right? That we pay 2.5 to 3.5 times, and that's on a net price basis compared to other European markets. And to be clear, the companies, if they're in those markets, that is because it's locally profitable to be there. So that doesn't mean they're going to lose money, be giving away anything. They'll actually still be profitable. They're also all higher than their inflation-adjusted launch prices. So that means because they have been systematically raising prices by rates greater than inflation over very long periods, they're actually being crammed down, if that's kind of where they end up, to prices that are better than they originally demanded in the market. And again, adjusted for the CPI. So that's sort of good news in the sense that you can't claim that this is nuclear winter or whatever, season 2 of Game of Thrones or something like that. Right, although we will hear it. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I wrecked it for people. Yeah. Season 1's pretty bad, too. The other thing is, just to Gregg's comment and to my earlier one about two sides of a coin, I know it's not popular at this conference, but if we're going to worry about deficit spending, we've got to think about both revenues and spending. We can't just say, okay, we're going to continue to aim to reduce taxes, and then we're just going to weep over the fact that our deficits are rising. Much should be done to control healthcare spending and other kinds of government spending, but the money is the problem. The near-term solution is clearly increasing taxes and restoring some of the tax gradation that we used to have, because there's no evidence that reducing taxes in the way we have has caused any sort of economic growth or improvements in welfare. So, and I'm not a tax policy expert, but just like you can't say we're going to reduce innovation without asking questions about the health welfare that's created by lowering drug prices, you can't talk about reductions in healthcare spending without talking about the other welfare effects of the deficit.
Next up, we'll have a panel on supply side tax cuts and a balanced budget amendment. But In response to those, and oh boy, in response to the series of questions I asked, it sounds like we got not coercive, it's going to work, and it could even lead to more innovation rather than less, but maybe more government spending.
I don't think it's going to lead to more government spending.
Okay, all right, because you almost talked me out of supporting the IRA's drug negotiation provisions. So I want to thank Gregg, Anna, and Peter for a great panel. Thank all of you for coming, and FREOPP for hosting this conversation. Thank you very much.